I've got several key messages for you today. First, there are a lot of changes in the store, but let's not lose sight of what's important in higher education, and in particular, its transformational potential and the capacity to empower people, including by opening up choices for them. Second, the need to base implementation of change on evidence of what works. Third, the importance of the links between individual students' engagement with their own personal learning and their collective involvement in decision-making about teaching and learning. Fourth, the key role of information, or actually, I quite like the fact that Steve mentioned the word communication rather than information, but also advice and guidance in all of this. And last but not least, the significance of staff engagement as well as student engagement. And I wanted to set those key messages out right up front so that they don't get lost in the detail of what I have to say. Let me start with, I'm sorry about my rather static and boring slides, but it is hefty, so you know. Let me start with some key aspects of the current and future policy context. First, on fees and funding, the sector is undergoing a significant set of changes which directly impact on both students and institutions. And with the introduction of higher fees, students may well operate much more like consumers in some aspects of their interactions with institutions. For example, in their demands for information and their use of services and facilities, and also in their expectations of timely feedback and efficient course organisation. And it's likely that institutions will want to respond to those demands in direct ways. Of course, this is not a new phenomenon. International students and some professional postgraduate students have been paying high fees for some time. And institutions have been responding to institutional student feedback and to the findings of the National Student Survey. But by the end of the spending review period, some institutions will receive the majority of their funding from students, or more accurately, the student's loan company, on their behalf. And this paradigmatic change, this shift, is likely to influence the behaviour of all parties. We're also seeing some changes to the quality assurance systems, and with apologies to Derville, I might mention some of these things later on, or not. Seeing some changes to the quality assurance system aimed at engaging students more effectively. The new institutional review process comes into force in England annual now, in fact, in 2011-12. The new method aims not only to safeguard quality and standards, but also to help improve student experiences of higher education, and students will be active participants in institutional reviews. And they should have greater knowledge and understanding of the external examining process, according to UK and GuildHE. And as a result of those developments, students should be much more involved in institutional quality assurance processes than has been the case in the past. The thematic topic for the initial year of the institutional review will be the first year student experience. On the eve of the new fee arrangements being introduced, I can't think of a more appropriate theme than the transition to higher education, the induction of learners into higher education study, and ensuring that their expectations are realistic, that they're fully aware of the opportunities available to them, and that their ambitions are achievable. We have been seeking to ensure that this new quality assurance system is as clear and as understandable as possible, that it's public-facing, to use the terminology. So, for example, together with the NUS, the QAA is developing a roadmap which explains the relationship between the various quality assurance and enhancement processes which operate to maintain standards and ensure the quality of the student experience. And of course, information for the public about higher education, including the NSS and the developing key information set, is becoming a mainstream element of the quality assurance system. From 2012-13, information will be a part of the judgments made in institutional reviews. I'll say a little bit more about the key role of information later in my talk. So what's HEFCE's role in all of this? Engaging with students is always central to how we work. already central to how we work. As set out in our strategic plan, we, quote, work with students and other stakeholders to ensure a high-quality learning experience that meets the needs of students, unquote. In the wider policy context, our role is likely to change with the implementation of higher fees. We'll know more about how our role is changing once we have the white paper in, I believe it's going to be in June. Steve seems to know differently. Who knows? It's more, July is probably more realistic, actually, given what's happened so far. But in the meantime, we continue to support institutions in delivering high-quality teaching and research, and engaging with students and protecting their interests is likely to remain central to our future purposes. To show this is not just rhetoric, I'll mention a few ways in which we currently seek to support student engagement initiatives. First, the Student Engagement Project. This is seeking to ensure a real step change in the participation of students and the effectiveness of student engagement within higher education institutions. We're continuing to provide funding and working with the NUS and the HE Academy, and they are supporting institutions and their students' unions to engage students more effectively in shaping their learning experiences. The first year of the project gathered material from across the sector and produced a toolkit of resources. In the second year, the project, and this is the second year, the project is developing and disseminating approaches to engaging students from hard-to-reach groups. It's considering staff and student development needs, and it's helping to develop self-sustaining coordination and dissemination of student engagement activity throughout the sector. We've also funded and supported the NUS Good Governance Project. This is aimed at all higher education students' unions. It has supported students' unions in identifying good practice in their current governance arrangements, and also helped to identify how governance could be improved. We have increased student representation on our committees. The NUS is represented as a full member of our Strategic Advisory Committee on Teaching Quality and the Student Experience. And the NUS President, Aaron Porter, is now an observer on the HEFKE board and participates fully in our discussions. And of course, we run the National Student Survey and publish the findings each year. Now, despite its limitations, it can be a useful reference point for current and prospective students, for institutions and others, and we're always seeking to improve it. And this year, for example, we'll be introducing benchmarks for the overall satisfaction scores. And these benchmarks, like others, will take account of student characteristics and subject-specific factors. And you'll know about our proposals to develop the key information set, or KISS, which I'll say a bit more about later. With the publication of this information, we hope that students will be better informed and therefore more likely to be engaged. One of my guises is as a researcher, you'd expect me to emphasise the importance of developing an evidence base for these developments in policy and practice. I'm going to just mention a few examples of studies and developmental work that are focused on student engagement. First, a Cherry study on student engagement that my colleagues Brenda Little, Ruth Williams and Anna Skazer and myself completed in 2008. This concluded that students were often viewed as customers rather than as partners in the learning community. The study made a number of recommendations to lead the sector towards working more collaboratively when developing student representation practices. These included carrying out an institutional and student union review of the student engagement cycle, including establishing criteria for monitoring its effectiveness, the discussion of appropriate staff and student development needs, and the production of materials to provide guidance to institutions on how to engage with students, and the development of practices that benefit student groups that are hard to reach, in particular part-time students. Clearly, a lot has happened since 2008, not least the Student Engagement Project that I've already mentioned. But the point I want to make here is that the original study was commissioned in a rather different context. The Labour government at the time was highlighting the student voice, a collective voice, to be expressed in student forums and through national reports, for analytical purposes and frankly to ensure that the Cherry project was feasible as a piece of commissioned research. We made a careful distinction. That distinction was between, on the one hand, student engagement in collective decision-making about policies on learning and teaching, in other words, their influence on learning and teaching largely through student representation and student feedback, and on the other, individual students' engagement or involvement with their own personal learning, their individual commitment to their subject, their level of understanding, their sense of responsibility for their own learning outcomes, and so on. The more personal engagement in learning is what the American National Survey of Student Engagement tries to capture. In the Cherry study, we deliberately focused on the collective macro processes, if I can put it that way. However, you can never divorce the two entirely, and I'd like us to reflect more on the links between those macro and micro processes. In other words, how participation in decision-making can help to motivate more engaged learning through quality enhancements, the empowerment of individuals and groups of students and so on, and how greater individual responsibility and commitment can in turn lead to a more expansive willingness on the part of individual students to participate in innovation and change. The new fees and funding policy context forces us to consider these more individualised concerns, but we should continue to explore what is common among learners that could form the basis of communal change. Now, some of these issues are touched on in the think pieces commissioned by the QAA following the agency's decision to include students as members of institutional review teams. As a consequence of bestowing them with the authority and responsibility that comes with this role, the QAA was asked questions about what this implied for the relationship between students and institutions and their role within higher education as a whole. These think pieces, including the one by Exeter colleagues, highlight some of the key themes to be discussed at this conference and will inform the development of the QAA's strategic plan. Indeed, the university is seeking to engage students as partners in shaping and leading their education experiences through the students as change agents, as we've heard already. As I understand it, the key concept is that students themselves take responsibility for bringing about change, based on their own research on aspects of learning and teaching. I'm looking forward to, I've learned already, and I'm looking forward to learning more about that, especially as the relationships between research, policy and practice, and the nexus between teaching and research remain particular research interests of mine on which I've published. I think it's worth reflecting on the various roles that students, institutions, staff and other communities may play in the future in a rather different policy context. Rightly, our focus has been on students' interests, on becoming more student-focused or even student-centred. I remember in the 1990s when I was a card-carrying educational developer promoting the idea of student-centred higher education as opposed to teacher-centred or curriculum-centred or even institution-centred education. But arriving in the early 2010s, supposedly at a point when students, or rather their choices, will drive higher education and quality improvement in particular. This isn't quite what I'd imagined. In fact, it's very different from what I'd imagined back then. So, what roles may students play in this new era? Well, certainly, given that they'll be paying higher fees, students are likely to demand more. I think Dertha will say a little bit more about that later on. But they are not paying up front, as Steve pointed out, and the greater debt they will incur is not like any commercial debt. So they are not the archetypal customers of classical economic theory. Where I think there may be most tension is around what students are getting for their fees, for their higher fees, and what additional costs of studying will be covered by that fee. By this I mean the materials, the trips, the facilities and services they can expect, for which they are likely to resist paying even more. It would make sense for institutions to spell out from the start what the standard fee, what the sticker price will cover, to use that ugly but nevertheless quite revealing phrase. This edges us towards some kind of contract for at least those aspects of higher education experience that can be guaranteed. But of course, much of the experience cannot be guaranteed. The learning outcomes, the personal chemistry between individual learners and lecturer, the group dynamics of students, and much else besides. We can hope that this experience will be so much more than just a transaction, that it will be transformational. But this can't be engineered. We can simply provide the conditions and the opportunities for it to happen. And to help achieve this, we can be clearer about the other roles, apart from customer or consumer, the other roles that students can play. As users of things of value that may not be restricted, such as information and some facilities and services, as partners in a learning community of scholars, researchers, visiting or virtual experts, professionals, and no less importantly, other students with their own experiences and expertise to share, as co-determinants of their higher education experience, who engage with commitment, enthusiasm, imagination with their own learning, as co-producers of knowledge who undertake research, experiment, design and create, as members of the student community, whether through the Students' Union or otherwise, the Guild of Students in this case, in providing opportunities for wider experiences, information, welfare services, campaigning and influencing decision making, as reviewers and evaluators who help to enhance the quality of educational provision, and as change agents, working with the institution or department or college to innovate in the curriculum, develop educational resources, engage with external communities, enhance employability, and so on. So let's not get bogged down on whether students are consumers or customers and lose sight of the many other roles they can also play. And while this certainly places students and their interests centre stage, it doesn't exclude other partners in the learning community from this platform. I'm thinking of the academic, professional and support staff, the institution itself, and the various external communities, the local area, academic networks, businesses, the voluntary sector, and so on. In fact, it depends on their engagement just as much as the students. And that's why I chose the title for this presentation, Engaging Communities, with a question mark, because I feel that the spotlight should be shone back on the institution itself and the extent to which it engages with its various communities, with paying students at its heart, but with its staff, alumni and external partners also critical to this process. In fact, the voices of university staff seem to have been largely unheard in recent times, if you believe what you see and hear in the media. The demonstrations against higher fees were portrayed exclusively as student demos, despite there being sizable staff contingents at many of them. And universities' responses to the policy changes have been simply reported in terms of which institutions' governing bodies have announced that they will be charging £9,000. It's as if the academics, professionals and support and administrative staff are invisible. And you, and I'm speaking to the majority here perhaps, you and your professional development needs in this new era are critical to the success of this enterprise. My motivation for saying this is partly that of a researcher who's been involved in an international study of the academic profession. During this I became concerned at how some parts of the UK academic profession seem to be disengaged from their institutions and from the governance and management of those institutions in particular. So my insights from this research have reinforced my emphasis on the need for institutions to become more engaging communities for their own staff as well as for their students and for the various communities they serve, some of which are listed on this slide. With these changing roles, the institution will need to think about the shifting the focus back onto itself as an organisation that involves its various communities. The onus is on the institution to engage with students, rather than on students to engage with the institution's existing processes. And this means making the higher education experience much more of a collaboration between the various participants. Institutions, schools, departments, colleges will need to consider what they mean by student engagement, or by asking students to be change agents or producers of knowledge, and the processes by which this is achieved. And they'll need to think about how they will connect individual students' engagement with their own learning at the micro level with the collective engagement of students at the macro decision-making levels. Students engaging at every level will help to bring about improvements and benefit the wider student population. For example, in the quality of the academic work, in the design of curricula and courses, in the equal treatment of those students on different modes of study and from diverse backgrounds, and in the effectiveness of quality assurance processes. And so to the important role of information in all of this. Providing easy and access to useful information to help students make informed choices about higher education study and beyond has become a high priority. But the debate has tended to focus on information for prospective students and on the provision of information without any great understanding of its likely use and the need for advice and guidance. I'd like to offer a view on the provision of information throughout the student life cycle, from making choices about what, where and how to study, where the kids will come into play, to the period of transition into higher education when perhaps a student charter, among other things, can help to clarify expectations, to decision-making on course, about course options, placements, vacation and part-time employment, extracurricular activities and so on, and to decisions about what to do after graduation, how to present achievements, both academic and more broadly perhaps through the Higher Education Achievement Report, much of which will of course be of interest to prospective students as well. So I presented this as a cycle in this rather clunky diagram compared with previous presenters, but it shows the relationship between the forms of information that might be useful at the different stages of the student life cycle, and how these might inform each other and ultimately be linked to some kind of common database within an institution, comprising the various elements of the KIS, the student charter, the HERE, and wider information, such as program specifications, entry profiles, module descriptions, and so on. But as I implied earlier, just providing inert information is not likely to be sufficient. At least the KIS and the HERE have a better sense of who are they for, why they're there, and what they're trying to do, compared to perhaps, say, the program specifications and the entry profiles. But ultimately, my personal opinion is that this official, authorised information will have to be animated and enlivened really, with input from students, alumni, employers, independent careers advisors, and others to become really useful. Much like the way that Wikipedia and social network sites annotate and elaborate on information topics. I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. So, finally, I haven't gone over my time already. Let me outline some of the key challenges for our work in this area. It can be difficult to anticipate the impact of the radical changes that we face in the sector on the behaviour and expectations of those participating in it. And there are significant changes for us too. The changes in society, demography, technology, the economy, and not least government policy. The student body is diverse and likely to diversify further. Feedback we receive continues to suggest that some groups are harder to engage with than others. Groups that are highlighted in particular include higher education students in further education colleges, part-time students, work-based learners, postgraduates, and distance learners. In the current economic climate, we expect increasing numbers of learners to participate in higher education in a non-traditional way, remotely, flexibly, and some more intensively, sometimes intermittently. Traditional 3-year full-time young residential undergraduates are a shrinking minority of our student engagement, and our student engagement activities have been slow to acknowledge this, let alone cater for it. And as I alluded earlier, we've asked the NUS and the Academy to look at ways to support the sector in developing and disseminating student engagement practice among each of these groups of students. It's difficult to anticipate how changes in the student finance system will affect how students choose to engage with their institutions, or indeed if these changes will have any impact at all. We know some of the changes that will be implemented, but there remains much to be revealed by the white paper. In addition to this, institutions themselves face significant changes to the way they are funded for teaching, and will be consulting later this summer on changes proposed for 2012-13. And it is reasonable to assume that both these interrelated sets of changes will in some way impact on student engagement. Certainly, it will help if the business case can be made for student engagement within institutions, especially in these times of financial constraint. The challenge now is to be clear about what we're trying to achieve through student engagement and why it is beneficial to both the learner and the institution, to identify and share a range of models that are effective across the sector, and to develop flexible student engagement processes to take into account changes in resources, expectations, and the demographics of students. These are all things that can be addressed during today's conference, in both the sessions and through informal conversations during breaks. So, thanks very much for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to your questions and constructive comments and the presentations and discussions during today's conference.